In the ravaged heart of Confederate Mississippi, amid the cannon thunder of the Vicksburg campaign, another silence persisted, deeper than the graveyards and quieter than the dead. Atop an oak-strangled hill, just beyond the city's crumbling boundaries, stood St. Philomena's Home for Girls, a grey, hulking convent school surrounded by high stone walls and kept off local maps. For decades, townsfolk referred to its pupils simply as the Silent Sisters. None had ever heard the girls speak. What began as a whispered curiosity among traders and Union scouts soon became a source of dread. The girls never aged, it seemed. Their eyes stayed fixed. Their voices were never known. And when the home was abandoned after the war, the records were locked, the portraits burned, and not one of the sisters was ever seen again. Founded in 1837 under the patronage of Bishop René Michel de la Croix, St. Philomena's was touted as a sanctuary of moral restoration for destitute Southern girls, especially the orphaned daughters of battlefield casualties. Publicly affiliated with the Ursuline Order, the institution received generous wartime exemptions and donations, praised for its spiritual science curriculum and extraordinary discipline. Its headmistress, Sister Honoria Duval, was described by Union pamphlets as a saint with surgical precision. Graduates of the home were allegedly sent to mission posts or convents across the Deep South, though no names appear in church ledgers after 1861. Local physicians admired its miraculous restraint therapies, which claimed to silence feminine hysteria without injury or force. Over time, however, townspeople stopped asking questions. The place had no laughter, no letters, no songs, only the occasional low bell tolling before dawn, and long, silent processions of pale-faced girls in black. The institution's reputation, St. Philomena's Home for Girls, did not emerge from necessity. It emerged from image. By the time the first brick was laid in the spring of 1837, Vicksburg had already positioned itself as a bulwark of Confederate pride and Christian virtue. The hill chosen for the convent was not coincidental. Once known as Soldier's Bluff, it had served as a lookout during the brief, failed Chickasaw raids of the early century. Its elevation made it ideal for a towered facility, one that could watch and be watched. What the townspeople didn't understand then was that this was precisely the intent. St. Philomena's wasn't designed as a refuge, it was built as a display. From its inception, the convent school enjoyed a relationship with the Diocese of Natchez that bordered on proprietary. Bishop René Michel de la Croix, a French transplant with rigid Gallican ideals, secured both the land and architectural plans with funds routed through private ecclesiastical channels. The building was modeled after a failed Jesuit seminary in Tours, with a singular Gothic turret, 6 dormitory wings, and a rear cloister that few outside the order were ever permitted to see. The cornerstone bore no dedication, no date, only a chiseled Latin inscription: In castitate silentium, in chastity, silence. Initial enrollment records show 36 girls, nearly all between the ages of 6 and 9, brought in from Jackson, Natchez, and surrounding parishes under sponsorships. Sponsorship, in this context, was rarely philanthropic. For every girl rescued from orphan trains or plague ships, another was handed over through private agreements, dowries exchanged for religious guardianship, or punishments disguised as salvation. Each girl was issued identical clothing within the first hour: a high-collared black dress with coarse underskirts, woolen stockings, and plain slippers. Hair was shorn to the shoulders, parted strictly at the center. No ribbons, no brooches, no color. Each was assigned a number rather than a name, written in black ink on a linen tag sewn inside the dress collar. Names, Sister Honoria would later testify, were considered attachments to worldly history. This was a house of moral rebirth. Individual identity was a vanity unsuited to the discipline of the soul. Sister Honoria Duval, the home's first and only superior, maintained meticulous personal notes, journals bound in black calfskin and stored in a chest that was later discovered empty during a post-war inspection. What fragments remain are quoted in letters from visiting clergy. One such entry, transcribed in an 1841 correspondence to Bishop de la Croix, reads, "The voice, when ungoverned, is the chief antagonist of sanctity. In our girls, we seek to erase the voice not by force, but by reverence, to offer silence not as punishment but as paradise. Early visitors to St. Philomena's encountered an atmosphere that was immediately alien. Unlike typical boarding schools of the period, there was no bell for recess, no nursery quarters, no music room. The girls were rarely seen in motion except during twice-daily processions to the chapel. Those who did observe them described a choreographed monotony, arms clasped at the waist, heads slightly bowed, not a whisper among them. When spoken to directly, even by visitors or nurses, the girls responded only with stillness. Some would nod faintly. Most gave no sign at all. Rumors began before the decade was out. Whispers in the Vicksburg market claimed that the girls were beaten silent. Others suggested that surgical interventions were to blame, but the physicians allowed inside, mostly Catholic sympathizers and Confederate loyalists, swore by the opposite. According to an 1844 letter from Dr. William T. Agnew, the girls exhibited a serenity I have never observed in cases of traumatized mutism. No signs of inflammation in the larynx, no lesions, no bruising. They are silent, not out of fear, but out of an eerie calm, as if the need to speak had simply been dismissed by the body. St. Philomena's curriculum, such as it was, consisted of Latin scripture memorization, needlework, penmanship, and physiognomic reflection, a practice imported from French novitiate orders. This involved girls sitting in silent pairs, mirroring one another's posture and expressions for hours. If one smiled, the other must follow. If one frowned, the other must echo. A mistake in mirroring resulted in isolation, a half-day without visual contact, during which the girl would face the chapel wall in what was known as God's correction. No record suggests that any child refused to participate. The staff were minimal, 9 sisters of the Ursuline order, all of whom had renounced their birth surnames upon entry. They referred to one another only by titles: sister instructor, sister custodian, sister provisioner. It is unclear how they were trained, or by whom. A surviving account from a Union nurse during the war described them as white-faced women in soot-black robes, hands always folded, moving without sound across the halls like shadows pinned to their habits. The nurse, whose name appears only as H.M., in her field diary, recalled asking one of the sisters whether the children were ever allowed to speak. The response came not in words, but in the quiet placement of a finger to her lips. A gesture, then silence. Public reports about the school remained positive throughout the 1840s and 1850s. Articles published in the Vicksburg Whig and the Southern Christian Advocate lauded St. Philomena's for its unparalleled quietude and revolutionary emotional governance. While the world outside unraveled into secessionist turmoil, the home was seen as a holdout of divine order. In a time when even our daughters are made unruly by pamphlets and preachers, one editorial claimed, St. Philomena's restores to us the obedient angel. But not all opinions were so generous. By 1856, a series of unsigned pamphlets began to circulate among local Baptist congregations. Known collectively as the Hilltop Reproaches, these tracts alleged that the home's practices bordered on cultic discipline. One passage described a sighting of girls kneeling barefoot in rows across the chapel lawn, eyes fixed forward, mouths moving in synchronized silence, not in prayer, but in mimicry. Another referred to unnatural stillness that lingered even in the youngest pupils. "No child who enters that place ever laughs again," the author wrote. "Their faces go slack, their voices die." These claims were dismissed as religious bigotry, and the diocese dismissed the tracts as heretical fiction. Still, by the eve of the Civil War, enrollment had slowed. Fewer families were sending girls, and the home took on more orphans from battlefield-adjacent parishes. These girls, often arriving sick or traumatized, were described as noisy upon entry. Yet within a week, according to Sister Honoria's final surviving letter, they became peaceful in the Lord's image, as if they'd always belonged. Photographic evidence from the period is scarce. Only 2 known images of the girls remain, both ambrotypes held in private collections. Each shows a row of pale children seated shoulder to shoulder in a stone-walled hall, faces forward, hands folded. Not a smile among them. One collector described the girls' expressions as perfectly blank, like the photo had erased their memories. Then came the siege. In 1862, as Union troops closed in on Vicksburg, many religious institutions shuttered or relocated. Not St. Philomena's. According to military dispatches, the convent remained operational throughout. Its gates never opened, its windows never lit. One night in April, a detachment of Union scouts passing near the hill reported hearing a slow bell tolling from inside the compound, though no mass was scheduled and no guards were posted. That same report claims to have seen a line of girls, 15 or more, standing barefoot in the dew at the property's edge, all facing outward, unmoving. No attempt was made to enter. The war had larger priorities, but by the time Vicksburg fell in July 1863, the home was empty. Union officers sent to inventory the property found the gates unlatched, the dormitories abandoned, and every journal or ledger in the superior's office stripped of pages. In the chapel, pews were overturned, the altar cloth was missing, and the crucifix bore scratch marks along its base. No bodies were discovered, no records remained, and none of the girls, not one, was ever accounted for. The diocese later claimed the children had been safely relocated to facilities in New Orleans, but no parish ever confirmed receiving them. Their names were never published. Their fates, like their voices, remained sealed. St. Philomena's was never reopened. By the 1870s, the building had been quietly sold to a Confederate veteran who intended to repurpose it as a cotton warehouse, but construction crews refused to work there. They claimed the place felt wrong. The building was finally razed in 1881, and its stone was used to construct a nearby drainage culvert. Nothing stands on the hill today but dry grass and 3 stone steps that lead nowhere, and the townspeople still call it the hill where no one speaks. Ignored signs. By the 1840s, when St. Philomena's home had begun attracting distant patrons and ecclesiastical praise, quiet objections were already accumulating in corners too modest to reach the ears of authority. Some came from the local poorhouse, where girls deemed unfit for the Lord's silence were returned without ceremony. Others emerged from backroom confessionals, where visiting priests reported hearing admissions from sisters, so riddled with ambiguity they could neither absolve nor disclose them. Yet each sign, each incident, each deviation from expected institutional behavior was either overlooked, rationalized, or made to disappear into the dense folds of religious respectability. The first ignored sign came in 1839, 2 years after the convent opened. A girl named Mercy Wainwright was discovered wandering half-dressed along a creek bed several miles east of the compound. Her shift was soaked through with stagnant water, her feet blistered raw. She was 8 years old, mute, and trembling so violently that a local widow took her in for 2 nights before the authorities were called. By the time a deputy brought her to the town's infirmary, she had not spoken a word, though she clutched a rosary until her palm bled from its pressure. When asked where she came from, she only pointed at her throat. 3 days later, Sister Honoria arrived to retrieve her. She carried no identification, only a letter signed by the bishop. Mercy was led away in silence. The woman who sheltered her received a thank-you note written in French. Within weeks, no one in town would speak of the girl again. Similar disappearances occurred across the next decade, though never enough at once to create a formal record. One girl was found behind the church stables during a thunderstorm, curled in a ditch and rocking without sound. Another was discovered in the bell tower of St. Albans, fingernails chipped to the quick, having scratched 6 vertical lines into the wood floor. Each time the sisters arrived with quiet apologies and ecclesiastical paperwork. Each time the girls vanished again behind St. Philomena's high stone walls, but not all warnings came from within. In 1846, a woman named Lydia Cole sent a formal complaint to the office of the bishop. Her niece, a 9-year-old named Sarah Bellamy, had been enrolled at the home following the sudden death of both parents in a house fire. Within 6 months, all letters from Sarah ceased. When Lydia requested visitation, she was denied under the explanation that sisterhood observation periods did not permit interference. Undeterred, she arrived at the gates of St. Philomena's unannounced. The groundskeeper, an elderly man with a congenital speech defect, met her at the gate. Lydia demanded to see her niece. He told her simply, "They're not ready." She pushed past him and was nearly to the side garden when 2 sisters in black habits intercepted her. They offered tea and a place to rest. She insisted again on seeing Sarah. The sisters exchanged no glances, only bowed their heads. Sister Honoria soon appeared, gracious and formal. "She is silent, but she is safe," was all she would say. Lydia left without seeing her niece. 3 weeks later, her body was discovered on the riverbank, drowned under unclear circumstances. The complaint letter, found unopened in the bishop's drawer during a later investigation, had been marked "exaggeration, to be filed." Another sign, perhaps the clearest of them all, came from within the medical community. Dr. Elias Varnum, a physician known for his work with convalescent soldiers, was brought to the home in 1852 to examine 3 girls who had become non-compliant. According to the sister provisioner who escorted him, the girls had ceased to engage in reflection practices and refused mirror exercises. They had begun to turn their backs during chapel recitations. Dr. Varnum's visit lasted less than an hour. He was never called back. In his personal notes, rediscovered in the attic of his Natchez home in 1913, he wrote, "There is something in those halls that removes the instinct for resistance. The 3 girls had identical postures, identical gaze. Their silence was not trauma. It was something learned, or worse, absorbed. When I asked to examine their throats, none opened their mouths. When I reached to gently tilt the chin of the youngest, her eyes widened but did not blink. She held my stare for a full minute without movement. There is a precision to their quiet I cannot explain." Rather than raise alarm, his notes were deemed unsubstantiated by the medical board. He retired within a year. By the late 1850s, those who knew of St. Philomena's regarded it with cautious distance. Shopkeepers who once delivered cloth and grain now sent apprentices in their place. Parishioners moved 1 pew away if a nun from the home entered church. Some began calling the girls the Marble Choir, a name that stuck long enough to appear in 2 separate county census records. One of the few to speak publicly was Father Owen Rusk, a visiting priest from Louisiana assigned to assist in Lenten rites. He was granted access to the chapel, the dormitories, even the reflection hall, the most restricted space in the convent. What he saw disturbed him enough to issue a report to his archdiocese, which was buried before it reached any formal review. In the reflection hall, Father Rusk described 52 girls seated in rows, each facing an identical girl across from her, their postures symmetrical, their hands joined loosely in their laps. The walls were windowless. No iconography adorned the space. He noted that when one girl blinked, her mirror partner blinked too. When one shifted a shoulder, the opposite girl mirrored the exact motion within half a second. The timing was flawless. But the worst, he said, was the sound, or rather the absence of it. He described a total vacuum, as if the room had been drained of air, as if breath itself were not permitted. He knelt to pray, and the moment he whispered a single line, the entire room turned to him at once. Every girl, simultaneously, without hesitation. He was escorted out before he could finish. His report concluded, "I do not believe these children are victims of cruelty in the traditional sense, but I believe something has been done to them, something that has severed their interior voice. They are more aligned with gesture than thought, more with posture than personhood. They are being unmade." But as with all previous signs, the report was quietly shelved. Father Rusk was reassigned to a coastal parish and later died during a yellow fever outbreak. The reflection hall, according to all records, remained in use until the very day the home was abandoned. A final warning came not in writing, but in the form of a runaway. Her name never made it into public records, but a journal belonging to a Union scout named Malachi Sutter preserved her appearance and behavior. On April 18, 1862, Sutter's unit encountered a barefoot girl walking the woods outside Vicksburg, her black dress torn at the hem, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. She did not speak nor respond to questions, but clutched a small wooden crucifix in both hands. When offered food, she ignored it. When water was poured into her palm, she stared at it without drinking. The girl was placed in the care of a field nurse, who recorded that she showed signs of neither starvation nor illness, but seemed incapable of registering sound. Her hearing was tested. No issue. She simply refused to respond to any auditory cue, including gunfire, dogs barking, or hymns sung near her cot. Her only reaction came during evening prayers, when the nurse whispered the Lord's Prayer. At the line, "Deliver us from evil," the girl flinched. Her hands clenched the crucifix until her knuckles went white. She vanished the next morning. Her absence was blamed on lax watch during guard rotation. No search was conducted. Sutter's journal entry concluded, "She came from the hill, I know it." She came from that place where the girls are never named, never seen, never heard. If war hadn't come, they would have kept her forever, and we'd still not know. By the time Union soldiers took Vicksburg, the warnings had become moot. St. Philomena's had already vanished behind a curtain of silence too thick to pierce. The gates were left open, the beds were empty, the ledgers were burned. But what echoes remained, in journals, in letters, in the minds of those who dared look, point to one simple truth. The silence was never natural, and it was never voluntary. It was taught, and the world, warned time and again, chose not to listen. Horror uncovered. The silence of St. Philomena's did not die with the war. It lingered, metastasized, embedded itself in the fibers of local memory like mildew behind stone. While Vicksburg tried to rebuild its homes and industries, the convent grounds remained untouched, its soil unturned, its gate rusted open like the mouth of something waiting to be named. But the city, torn and limping, had other wounds to bandage. Few wanted to speak of the place, fewer dared approach it, yet the horror had not been buried. It had been packed tightly into hidden rooms, into brick recesses, into notebooks scrawled and hidden, hoping not to be found. The first of those notebooks surfaced in 1879, when a carpenter named Claiborne Detch found himself assigned to a drainage project east of the former convent site. The job required the excavation of a narrow channel meant to divert storm runoff away from the hillside. As the team dug into the dense clay beneath what had once been the western dormitory wing, Claiborne's spade struck wood. Not a coffin, not a support beam, a box. Charred at the corners, sealed with resin. Inside was a cloth-wrapped bundle of papers, some half-burned, others water-stained, all bearing the same angular script. Many were unreadable. But what could be deciphered chilled the workmen so completely that one abandoned the site entirely and refused to return. The documents were the personal reflections of Sister Custodian, whose given name never appears. Dated sporadically from 1840 to 1862, the entries do not form a linear narrative, but instead echo a growing dread. She writes of observing the girls mimic each other even outside reflection hours. She writes of waking in the night to find 4 girls standing silently outside her door, eyes wide, hands joined, unmoving. When she asked them to return to bed, they turned simultaneously and walked away without a word. In one passage, she confesses to dreaming of mirrors. "The children are not praying, they are reflecting us. We believe we are shaping them, but they are shaping us in reverse. They know what we want before we want it. And they give it to us without voice, without hesitation." Another page describes a girl who refused to mirror. She was taken to the observation chamber, a room for intensive reflection correction, and never returned. Days later, a new girl filled her bed, her number stitched in fresh thread. No records showed a transfer. Sister Custodian writes, "Perhaps it is the same girl. Perhaps they made her again." The notebook ended with a final line, dated the day before the convent was found empty. "They are all awake now." News of the discovery was not published. The contractor overseeing the site reportedly turned the box over to a parish archivist who claimed it was unauthenticated. It vanished shortly after. But Claiborne, shaken, shared copies of 2 pages with a Union veteran named Charles Glend, who had served briefly in the Vicksburg occupation force. Glend, already suspicious of the convent's wartime evacuation, began his own investigation. What he found added depth to the already staggering silence. First, there was the cemetery, or rather, the lack of one. St. Philomena's had operated for 25 years. Had any institution of its size, especially one serving children, many in fragile health, there would have been a burial ground. But no graves were ever registered, no death certificates issued. A local gravedigger named Silas Reed told Glend that in his 30 years of work, he'd never once dug a grave for a girl from the home. Either they never died, he said, or they died and never left. Glend also tracked down Sister Baptista, the only nun known to have survived past 1870, under her convent name. She was living under an assumed identity in Baton Rouge, taking in laundry and refusing church attendance. After weeks of coaxing, she agreed to speak, but only with the curtains drawn and the door locked. "They weren't girls by the end," she whispered. "They were mirrors that forgot how to break." She explained that by 1858, the children no longer required instruction. They rose, dressed, and moved through their day without prompting. They formed into mirrored pairs without being told. They cleaned and prayed in perfect silence. And when one of the sisters, Sister Instructor, suffered a stroke mid-morning prayer, none of the children moved to help her. They watched. For 20 full minutes, eyes fixed, postures identical. "She died," Baptista said, "and they copied her death. One by one they all lay down, perfectly still, like it was part of the lesson." The sisters panicked. They rang the bell, dragged the girls to their feet, but none spoke, none cried, none asked questions. That night, Sister Custodian bolted her door. Sister Provisioner refused to leave the chapel. And Sister Honoria wrote her final note to the bishop. "They no longer require our instruction. They have exceeded us." By the next morning, 7 girls were missing. No signs of escape, no doors breached. Their beds slept in, their dresses left neatly folded. Within a week, 12 more had vanished. Each time the remaining girls showed no concern, no change in routine. They filled the empty spaces without question. Baptista believed they weren't escaping. They were choosing, she said, not to leave, to disappear. As Glend compiled his findings, he approached the Diocese of Natchez for comment. He was turned away. When he submitted an article draft to the Vicksburg Post, it was rejected as unfit for publication. The editor told him, "People don't want to know what happened up there. They want to forget it. Let them." But Glend was not alone. Other veterans who had marched past the home during the war remembered details they had tried for years to suppress. One described the scent, not of death, but of absence. It was like the earth itself was holding its breath. Another recalled hearing a low hum during night patrols. Not music, not machinery, a resonance. Like 50 voices whispering the same breath over and over. No investigation was ever officially conducted. In 1883, the city approved the final demolition of the remaining stone walls. During the leveling, workers unearthed a trapdoor sealed beneath a pew in the chapel ruins. It opened onto a narrow stairwell carved directly into the bedrock. The chamber below was small, no larger than a pantry, and contained only a bench, a shattered hand mirror, and 5 iron rings embedded in the wall. Nothing was reported to the press. The foreman's log simply read, "Additional chamber found, cleared." Later that year, a series of fires broke out along the hill's perimeter, scorching the grass and damaging nearby fencing. No cause was determined. A final attempt to establish a foundation on the land, a proposed veterans' hospital, was abandoned after multiple surveyors reported feeling watched. And then, as if in collusion with the silence it birthed, the hill went quiet. In 1891, a teacher named Nora Witt, newly arrived from Biloxi, took her pupils on a history walk through Old Vicksburg. When they reached the road leading toward the former St. Philomena grounds, one child, a girl of 9 named Edith, stopped suddenly. She stared up the hill, eyes wide. When asked what she saw, she whispered, "She's copying me." Nora looked. There was no one. But Edith would not move. She remained at the base of the hill for nearly an hour, repeating, "She's copying me," again and again until her voice cracked. She never spoke again after that day. Medical records list her diagnosis as acute psychological withdrawal. She died at age 19 in a state sanatorium. Over time, stories like hers became the whispered folklore of Vicksburg. Children dared one another to climb the hill at night. Parents threatened to send misbehaving daughters to the sisters. A preacher once held a revival at the foot of the slope. His tent burned down 3 days later under mysterious circumstances. But no formal recognition of what occurred at St. Philomena's was ever made. No plaque, no memorial, no inquiry, only silence. And beneath that silence, something deeper. Something that had watched, mirrored, and waited. Legacy and silence. By the turn of the 20th century, St. Philomena's had become less a memory and more a cavity, a blank in the landscape of Vicksburg that residents circled without speaking. Maps labeled the hill as unoccupied municipal reserve. Locals called it the place with no sound. Children born after the war were raised on vague warnings, half-fictions passed between porch rails and barber chairs. The convent, when mentioned, was never named, only referred to in past tense, always avoided in present tense, and yet its shadow deepened. In 1904, a traveling scholar from Tulane University named Dr. Howard Clemmer arrived in Vicksburg researching Southern pedagogical systems. He had no knowledge of St. Philomena's. The convent did not appear in diocesan rosters or state educational archives. It was only when reviewing early census maps that he noticed a large unmarked structure labeled Private Ecclesiastical Facility from the 1850 roll. Curious, he asked around. The replies were cautious, fragmented. One hotel clerk muttered, "Not your kind of history." A grocer warned him not to go up there after dark, but a retired tax assessor, Samuel Cricks, finally broke the surface. He had lived in Vicksburg since 1849 and remembered the convent well. He told Clemmer that during the siege, townspeople had begged the sisters to open the home as a shelter. They refused. "Not even when the cannon hit the aqueduct," he said. "They said their silence was part of God's shield." Clemmer climbed the hill alone. What he found, what he documented in his unpublished manuscript Reflections of the Unrecorded, cemented the horror that still lay dormant beneath the soil. He located the remnants of the cloister, just fragments of foundation, a sunken floor beam, the iron base of what may have been a stove. But more disturbingly, he found symbols scratched into stone. Not crosses, not saints, heirs. 2 small circles, side by side, always in pairs. Sometimes joined by a single line, sometimes offset but always repeated, over door frames on fallen stones, and most disturbingly, inside a collapsed well, etched deep into the brick lining. Clemmer interpreted the symbol as a mark of mirror ritual, a form of discipline through synchronized suffering. He concluded that the girls had not merely been silenced, they had been restructured. Trained to replicate suffering so precisely that individuality became obsolete. A mechanical empathy, he wrote, but without emotion, only echo. He published none of this. The manuscript was found among his belongings after his death in 1916, marked with one final handwritten note in red pencil, "They are still mirroring." By mid-century, the hill had become a gravitational point for the inexplicable. In 1932, a WPA survey crew assigned to map erosion patterns refused to include the area in their final report. One worker quit mid-assignment after hearing footsteps behind him on flat ground. In 1955, a group of schoolboys exploring the area as part of a scouting exercise emerged shaken and unable to explain why they had removed their shoes or why their footprints followed them perfectly on the walk back. One boy was later hospitalized for paranoid fixation. He claimed he kept seeing his own eyes blink in the dark. A more systematic inquiry came in 1971 when Dr. Viola Hardin, a sociologist from the University of Illinois, launched an oral history project focused on postbellum trauma among Southern religious institutions. She interviewed former residents of Vicksburg, by then elderly and wary, most of whom declined to speak of the hill directly. But one woman, Hazel Greaves, born in 1888, finally relented. "I wasn't supposed to know," Hazel said, "but my aunt worked in the laundry. Said the girls used to sit so still their skin would sweat patterns into the stone benches. Said one of them carved letters into her own collarbone, not words, just her number, 49. Hazel also shared a photograph. It was grainy, badly faded, and cracked along the edges. But the image was unmistakable. 7 girls seated in a line, shoulder to shoulder, hands folded, faces blank. Each wore the same collar, the same black dress, the same center-parted hair. But their expressions, vacant, wide-eyed, spiritually absent, bore no humanity. Behind them stood 3 nuns, also facing the camera, also unblinking. The back of the photo simply read, "Reflection Class, 1857, Dr." Hardin included the image in her research presentation the following spring. Several attendees reported feeling watched during the slide. The university received anonymous letters afterward demanding the image be destroyed. It was quietly removed from the archives in 1973. Hardin retired 2 years later and never published a full report. Despite efforts to erase it, the presence of St. Philomena's refused to die. In 1988, the Vicksburg Historical Society considered a project to reclaim the hill as a public park. Funding was secured, designs were drafted. But just before land clearing began, the surveyor flagged several unexplained subsoil voids. Ground-penetrating radar detected symmetrical cavities spaced at regular intervals beneath the surface. Initial speculation suggested old storage vaults. But when test digging began, the cavities were found to contain nothing. No debris, no bones, only soft packed earth, and at the center of each pit, a single stone with a pair of circles scratched into its face. 20 such cavities were found, all equidistant, all empty. The project was cancelled. The hill was reseeded with grass. Today, little marks the site. A few warped boards from a weathered footpath. A rusted fence post that once held an entrance sign, and occasionally a circle of worn earth where no grass will grow, no matter the season. Locals still warn their children. Don't play on the convent hill. Don't stare too long at your own reflection. And every so often, not often but enough, a visitor will stop near the base of the slope and hear a sound they cannot place. A sound not of wind, nor birds, nor rustling brush, but breath. Shallow, slow, perfectly mirrored breath, as if someone, just behind them, were inhaling at the exact same time. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way we can see how far these stories are reaching. And subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget. But we insist on remembering